All right. I hope everyone is having a good evening. I am Michelle Cobb, Executive Director of the Podcast Academy, and it is my pleasure to introduce to you our speaker for this evening, James Cridland from Podnews, who is a member of the TPA and is an expert in everything podcast. So he will be taking questions at the end. So feel free to put any questions that you have in the Q&A box, not the chat box. All right, James, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Cool. Thank you so much, Michelle, and many congratulations on the Ambies as well, which was a jolly good job. Well done. So, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for spending an evening if you're on the East Coast, a late afternoon on the West Coast, or if you're in Australia, a morning. Because that's how it works. I'm talking to you from tomorrow. And I'm going to talk about the world out there, the world that is further out of the US borders. Firstly, let me press a button and make sure that that works. That's good. That's the view from about 10 minutes walk away from my house. And I should start just by acknowledging that I'm talking to you today from Turrbal and Jagera land, and I would like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. The indigenous people who own the land on which I live actually have a very long history of telling stories using nothing more than their voice. So it's a wonderful thing that I'm here talking about podcasting today. For those of you who don't know me, I used to be a radio futurologist. I used to travel the world talking about the future of audio and particularly radio. I've worked with a bunch of radio broadcasters across the world and very much enjoyed doing that. And in 2017, I started writing a daily podcast newsletter called podnews.net. It's very good. It's free. It's available now. You should get it. At podnews.net, and that covers everything you need to know about podcasting across the world. So today I'm going to be having a look at how people are consuming podcasts across the world. I've got some thoughts about what's driving that particular growth for you. There are some interesting countries to watch and some ideas around production. I've got quite a few graphs, so sorry about that. And I've got some pictures of beer, because it is beer o'clock where you are. It's not beer o'clock where I am. Firstly, though, we'll start with a little question for you, see if you know the answer to this. What do these countries have in common? There are countries from across the world, weirdly. Andorra, Belarus, Sweden, Tajikistan, Liechtenstein, Luxembourg. If you know what any of these countries have in common, then great. Keep it to yourself. We'll have the answer at the end, but it might surprise you. So let's start with my new favorite piece of data of all time, which is this. The total amount of people who live inside the US is 4.25% of the world's population. So the total amount of people who live outside of the US is therefore 95.75%, if I've done my maths correctly. That's an important thing to bear in mind, because there are an awful lot of us who don't live inside the US. There's real opportunities for podcasting outside of the US, and that's what I plan to be talking about today, along with, as I've said, pictures of beer. This is some nice beer from the UK called Sandbrooks. It's where I grew up, as you can tell. I have this aloof British accent. Sorry, can't do anything about that. I now live here in Australia. That's my local beer. Don't buy it, it's not particularly good. So where are we in terms of podcasting? Well, a year or so ago, I asked Pocket Casts to tell me the most popular podcasts subscribed by users of their app, and they came up with this list. They actually came up with a top 100 list for me of worldwide podcasts. So this was before Joe Rogan hop, skipped and jumped with his large wad of money into Spotify. Both worldwide podcasts, but also podcasts in the UK and podcasts in Australia. And if you can, if you've got great eyesight, you can probably see that all of these are all American, all from the US. So the most popular podcasts in the world are from the US. As you start looking at individual countries, though, you see that there is a little bit of a difference. There's still quite a lot of US podcasts in the UK and in Australia, for example, but there is also quite a lot of podcasts which aren't, podcasts which are from their own individual countries. And in fact, if you start having a look at the top 100, you notice that 91% of the top 100 podcasts are from the US, with Britain adding another 9. Maybe it's just because we speak the same language, who knows. In the UK, 62% of the top 100 podcasts are from overseas, 38% British, and similarly in Australia, 1 in 5 of the most popular podcasts in Australia are from Australia as well. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's no podcasting going on here in Australia, for example. There's lots. There's a lot of Australian podcasting happening, particularly happening from other media companies. So the Australian, which is a big newspaper that Rupert Murdoch owns, boo, he has a bunch of very popular podcasts, The Teacher's Pet being one of those that came out last year. But the research says that actually quite a lot of podcast listeners don't care whether podcasts are from Australia or not. That's not how they choose. They end up choosing because it's relevant and because it's interesting to them. The one thing that I would point out, though, is yes, 79%, oh, look at that, 79% of podcasts consumed in Australia are from overseas, but there's an awful lot of advertising in those podcasts, which is wasted advertising. Blue Apron doesn't deliver here. Casper mattresses, can't buy them here. Geico insurance, unavailable here. We have no TV ads with annoying British-voiced lizards. What we do have, though, is we have a pretty large audio market, around 550 million US dollars, and there is a particular, I think, opportunity for podcasters across the world to geo-target advertising for countries that is local advertising. Here are some of those companies who will actually help you sell advertising in your podcasts overseas. So when I'm listening to, for example, the New York Times Daily, I think that's sold here by the Australian Radio Network, or iHeartRadio as it's called over here. But also Ranieri & Co. look after a bunch of podcasts here, as do Whooshka. In the UK, there's Podfront, there's DAX and TPX in Canada. There's the Spotify Audience Network, which is available in 4 different countries. Of course, there's Acast across the world. There's lots of different ways of selling the same ad space that you're currently selling in the US to US advertisers and US consumers. There's a lot of other ways of selling the same ad space and earning additional money out of that from people overseas as well. So where's the opportunity in terms of overseas? Well, total English speakers looks a bit like this. There are lots of English speakers in the US, obviously, but there are also a lot of English speakers elsewhere. India is a large market, and we'll get on to India a little bit later. Nigeria is very big, Pakistan, China, and so on and so forth. But if you were to have a look at the percentage of English speakers in each particular country, then Ireland is number 1. 98% of people in Ireland speak English, 4.3 million of them. New Zealand, the UK, Australia, and the US, as you can see, and so on, it goes down. And the reason why I'm pointing this out is that particularly if you start having a look at the Nordic countries, Sweden, Denmark, places like that, places that, yes, they do speak a different language there, but they also understand English, frankly, just as well as I do. You can see 86% of people in Sweden and Denmark, and the figures are quite high in terms of Norway and Finland as well. So those are real opportunities, even if you wouldn't necessarily have thought of them at first. And the Netherlands being 90% of people who speak English in that particular country. Where are we in terms of consumption? Well, this is where we are in terms of consumption. The US, around 41% of people, as you know, listen to podcasts every single month. This is adults. Canada is slightly behind. Australia is slightly behind, but still very, very high. More than a third of people listening to podcasts every single month. The rest of the world? Well, we don't know, because there isn't an Edison Research infinite dial, certainly over the last couple of years, for other countries. But there is another piece of data which has been put together by the Reuters Institute and the University of Oxford. And that data I published in Podnews about 2 weeks or so ago when it first came out. This is going to be impossible to read. So sorry about that. But the number one, according to their data, is Ireland, with 41% of people listening to a podcast in the last month. The average is 31%, where Australia fits. The US is above that. The UK is significantly below that, and part of that may be that we don't know what a podcast is in the UK, Japan, Germany, and so on and so forth. So many congratulations to Ireland. Ireland, of course, the home of Guinness. And Guinness, weirdly, is one of the best-selling beers in Africa, where it's really succeeded. I think I took this photograph in Ghana in a very fancy hotel bar. So that was nice. So one plea for you, if you are working in the international sphere in terms of podcasting, please invest in comparable data. Because yes, there is data out of the UK, there's data out of Germany, there's data out of parts of the Nordic countries and so on and so forth, but they're not measuring the same thing. And if they don't measure the same thing, then we don't know that actually we can compare the data with other people. So if you are working and investing overseas in podcasting, please do consider helping Edison Research and paying for Edison Research to get some data around the countries that you're interested in as well. That comparable data is massively important for the entire industry. And as a great American president once said, a rising tide gathers all boats. And it would be really good to be able to share some of that information. Let's have a look at a little bit more consumption information. This is a nice graph. And it shows that actually different people listen to podcasts in different ways because different people have different phones. This is data showing the amount of the usage of iPhone versus Android. You can see in North America, it's 40% iPhone, 60% Android. That's pushed a little bit by Canada, which has a little bit more Android usage. But you can see that it's very different in other parts of the world. Europe, 2/3 of Europeans use Android phones. In South America, 86% of people use Android phones. And it says down there, Oceania, it's about 50-50. That's only because Oceania includes Australia and the 26 million people of us who live here. We have about 60% iPhone, 40% Android. It's not the same in most other parts of the region here. So if you are promoting Apple Podcasts as the only thing, and certainly if you are selling Apple Podcast subscriptions, good luck with that, because most people can't use that. Most people can't access Apple Podcasts because we're using proper phones. So just bear that in mind in terms of how you're promoting your individual shows, because that's a really important thing just to bear in mind. Do jump into the Q&A bit, not the chat bit, but the Q&A bit, if you've got questions about this or anything else, and we'll come to those at the end. Another thing just to bear in mind is the cost of mobile data, or as they call it here in Australia, data, which is very confusing. Mobile data looks quite expensive. This is for about 30 gig of mobile data in US dollars. Canada is insanely expensive in terms of mobile data, although these figures have actually come down a little bit since I did this research. If you're looking at this and going, well, India looks great, India looks like exactly the sort of place that we should be going into. Yes, mobile data is very cheap, but people don't get paid an awful lot there as well. So I thought it might be useful to add here a percentage of your monthly income to actually work out whether or not this would be a good thing. I think this is actually yearly income. Anyway, whatever the percentage is, you can see that there is a bit of a change here. The US, yes, you get about 30 gigs worth of data for $75. That's 2% of your yearly income if you were going to end up spending that on your mobile phone. But you can see it's significantly higher in places like the Philippines, and indeed India as well. So the cost of data has something to just bear in mind in terms of the growth and the take up of podcasting in other countries as well. As is the other ways of consuming podcasts. So you will be familiar with these sorts of graphs. This is from Libsyn, who's an excellent podcast company. They say relatively recently that Apple Podcasts and iTunes account for about 64% of all downloads, Spotify about 10%, Google Podcasts is there at about 2%, and then you've got the rest. You can tell how old I am now from this graph, with Stitcher, Overcast, Castbox, and Podcast Addicts being in there. Now, bear in mind when you see these figures that around 2/3 of Libsyn's downloads happen within the US. So what you're seeing here is very skewed towards how people in the US consume podcasts. It's a very different world when you start having a look outside of the US. If you go to the Czech Republic, for example, the home of Pilsner, that you might know as lager, if you go to the Czech Republic, this is what podcast consumption looks like. This is some data from Czech Radio. And they have in the Czech Republic a 20% iPhone Android share. So only 20% of people in the Czech Republic, or Czechia as it's now known, use a iPhone. And you can see here that over the last, over the last year or so, you can see a significant growth in the amount of podcasts being consumed on Spotify, which is green. Yes, Apple Podcasts is still growing in Czechia. That's the purple. And there is a little bit of Google Podcasts in here as well. But Spotify is being quite successful in many parts of Europe. So Spotify most certainly number one for this particular podcast publisher, and Spotify itself has a bunch of users in places like Europe, Latin America, and the rest of the world. So if you're only in Apple Podcasts and you're not yet in Spotify, obviously make sure that you're in Spotify and make sure that you're actually using that. But it also goes to show that the most popular podcast platform in many parts of the world is actually Spotify. It's the most popular in this place, in Germany. This is the best-selling wheat beer in the world. It's very nice, quite sweet. Gives me a bit of a headache. Try not to have too much of it. Anyway, this is data again from the University of Oxford and the Reuters Institute showing what platforms people use to listen to podcasts. And there's a big difference. YouTube is actually there at number one in quite a lot of places, including the US and here in Australia. You can see Spotify is number one in Germany. And in the UK, the BBC has the number one podcast app. It's not really a podcast app. It doesn't understand RSS feeds, but nevertheless, this is how people are consuming podcasts. It's a very different world in different countries. So again, worthwhile bearing in mind when you're marketing podcasting, when you're focusing on which platforms to be in, not necessarily to rely on Apple Podcasts. or indeed Spotify, but to rely on other platforms as well. And similarly, that goes when you're talking about smart speakers. Here in Australia, smart speakers are overwhelmingly run by Google, with 68% of the market here. Alexa has a far, far smaller market. So again, we do use different things. This is some Spanish beer, Estrella Damm, which is very nice. I'm showing you a Spanish beer because iVoox is a really popular Spanish language podcast app. It has a significant part of the Spanish market and also the Spanish language market as well. And if you are, for example, producing content in Spanish, you really should be making sure that you're on the iVoox platform, which is the I logo here. Let's go to India. This was some beer that I had in India when I was last there in 2010. Really strong, not very nice, I have to say. But anyway, India is a fascinating place. This is the most popular podcaster probably in the world. It's Prime Minister Modi. He puts together a podcast that reaches hundreds of millions of people every single month. It is also broadcast on the radio as well. India is the largest English-speaking country outside of the US. 125 million speakers there. 35% of mobile phones are smartphones. Now, you might think that that's quite low, but there are other types of phones available in India, which we'll get into. But Ghana and JioSaavn, two very large music services that also have podcasts in them, a lot of people are finding that they're getting a lot of listeners through these particular apps. So make sure that you're listed in both Ghana and JioSaavn. A little word to the wise, when you're signing up to Ghana, and you'll find links to all of this if you search podnews.net for either Ghana or JioSaavn. When you're signing up to Ghana, just make sure that you uncheck the box that says, can we cache your audio? No, you don't want that. So Ghana and JioSaavn, very large podcast apps and music apps for India and for that part of the world. But there is also this, which is PodLP. Now, this is a podcast app which is available on KaiOS phones. Now, KaiOS is a very cut down phone. It's, as you can see, it's a phone that uses a proper keyboard, not necessarily a touch screen. And KaiOS is a very popular podcast app in parts of the developing world, both in places like India and in Africa. The phones themselves are about $10. So they're really, really cheap. And PodLP has some interesting things in there. It's worked with the Podcast Index to do the alternate enclosure tag, which allows you to also give people a much lower bitrate version of your podcast, which is therefore much cheaper to download. Podnews has one of those. And that's something that Thomas, the developer of PodLP, has been working on as well. So worthwhile making sure that you're in PodLP if you're not already. This is some Chinese beer, Qingtao, which is excellent beer. China is a really interesting market. It has its own Podfest, which is all very exciting. This was Podfest in 2019. We'll do a quick check of what 2020 looked like in just a minute. China is a very different market to the rest of the world. It has a very large paid-for podcast market. Some of the big players in the market is Himalaya, which is the logo on the left, and Liji, which is the logo that looks like a lychee, because that's what that is, on the right. They possibly have a different definition of the word podcast. I think you can have a look at a bunch of different things going on in China. And I think what is very clear is that, yes, they have podcasts like you and I understand podcasts. And there's a podcast that I reported on last week called Story FM, which has millions of listeners. But they also have a bunch of audio content which we probably wouldn't call podcasts and is a bit more educational and a bit more paid for. Yes, there is Apple Podcasts in China, but you're probably not there because it's only shows from select partners. Apple has particular content rules in that particular country, which probably means that you're not likely to be there. There are a bunch of other podcast apps which are available in China. Let's have a look at them because Podfest China, this was their 2020 event. And it seems to do very well for them. They also shared a bunch of data, which you'll find if you do a search for Podfest China on podnews.net. And these are two slides from that data. The first one is what people are listening to podcasts on. Apple Podcasts is number one, yes. But also you have Himalaya in there, you have NetEase Cloud Music, whatever that is, because I don't know. You've got WeChat, listening to podcasts in WeChat. Legi FM is in there, as well as Qingding FM and QQ Music and various other things. Now, you'll also see in here that there are podcast apps like Castro and Overcast and Castbox and Pocket Casts. This data was put together in the middle of last year. After that, the Chinese government have taken most of the other podcast apps out of the stores, so you can now no longer get podcast apps in China, apart from some of the more local players. So just worthwhile bearing that in mind. But yes, people are listening to podcasts in a bunch of different ways in the Chinese market. But this is the other one which I think just goes to show that perhaps the definition of podcast is rather different. This is a slide which is, again, going to be impossible to read, but it says around paying for content. The top line, 58% say that they will pay first and consume later for audio content, like, for example, an online audio course. Then 48% of people say that they pay later, consume first. So that's donations and that sort of thing. Or WeChat official account posts, which allows you to pay for the content that you have consumed. 47% say that they will pay for premium content or to remove ads. The freemium model that we're familiar with here. And only 11% of Chinese podcast listeners say that they have never paid for content. So it's a very different world, I think, in terms of China. Lastly, let me take you to the UK. This was a nice pub in Suffolk when I was last there, when the Australian government last let me out of this country. The UK, again, you might think that it's a really simple and easy market to jump into. There are two things going on in the UK that you should be aware of. One thing is the BBC is massively large. It has a 50% market share for radio. It runs nearly 60 radio stations in the UK. 10 of them are national. It achieves an incredible high market share for UK podcasts, and nothing in the UK from the BBC contains any advertising whatsoever, not even sponsorship, underwriting credits, NPR, none of that stuff. So the BBC is very much ad-free because everybody has to pay for it as part of owning a television, would you believe? But also the BBC has, clearly changed how people consume audio content in that particular country. And as a result of that, because there's no cultural reference for an NPR, funding drive or any of that sort of thing, and I know that lots of Christian broadcasters do the same sort of thing in the US, there's no cultural reference for that whatsoever. The idea of voluntarily paying for some of the content that you're listening to is a really strange thing for people in the UK particularly. So things like Patreon, buymeacoffee.com, Ko-fi, all of those types of things work rather less well in the UK because we're just not used to it than they would work in the US. Finally, there are some differences in terms of Europe and the US in terms of podcast consumption. Let me show you one last piece of information from the Reuters Institute and the University of Oxford research. These are the reasons why people don't use podcasts. The US is in blue. Europe is in orange here. And the US is in blue. You can see that there's basically not that much difference. Apart from two of these things, podcasts are too long. More people in the US think that than people in Europe. Make your podcast shorter, edit them more. But also, secondly, the one that you can see second from the top here, I don't really know what a podcast is. Europe has a big problem still with not knowing quite what a podcast is. You can see that that figure is 17% in Europe versus 9% in the US. A bit of caution with this data. Europe here includes the UK and Ireland. Now, they completely understand what podcasts are. So my suspicion is once you start looking at continental Europe, then this figure is even higher of people that don't know what a podcast is. So perhaps you're starting at a slightly different area there. Finally, let's take a quick look at production, what it means for you if you're making shows and all of that kind of thing. Let me just start with a success story from Saudi Arabia. This is a podcast called Saka's Eclipse, which was an Arabic language podcast. It was a branded podcast from Toyota. And Toyota did incredibly well with this particular show. In terms of the recall and in terms of what people felt about the Toyota brand after hearing this particular show. I think the figures, and again, I reported on this in Podnews, I think 93% of people who listened to this podcast wanted then to go and buy a Toyota car or at least visit a dealership. 93%, which is amazing. Here are some examples of where US or Canadian English broadcasters have produced content and then moved those out to other languages and other cultures. I'm starting in Canada because this is quite interesting. Brainwashed, which is a very popular podcast from the CBC, the English-speaking broadcaster in Canada. They then worked with their colleagues at Radio Canada, the French-speaking broadcaster, to produce Brainwash Les Corbeilles Oubliées, the Forgotten Guinea Pigs. Which is not just a translation of Brainwashed, but also additional French language reporting in there as well. So there's an additional piece of work which has gone on to make the French language version of this podcast a different experience and an experience that fits better with the Quebecois culture than the English language podcast. Worthwhile bearing that part in mind. Here's another example from iHeartMedia. You might have heard of them. And Podimo. Podimo is a company based in Copenhagen that helps quite a lot of people translate and make their podcasts better for other countries. So you can see here, this was a story that I covered when in March of this year, where they had taken the podcast, The Forgotten Women of Juarez, and translated that into a bunch of different languages, into Danish, into German, and into Spanish for Latin America as well. The thing that I would draw your attention to, again, is that this wasn't just a translation. This was more than that. So the Spanish version, for example, was clearly included rather more interviews in their own language. The version in Danish and in Germany actually had journalists from those countries taking the story that was going on in Mexico here and actually putting some context around that for listeners in Denmark and listeners in Germany. It's not just a case of just doing a quick translation and doing that sort of thing. There's additional culture and additional reporting which has gone on here as well. And here's another example from Amazon's Wondery. They have a very popular podcast called Business Wars. And as you can see, they have produced versions of Business Wars working with local production companies to produce versions that work really well in those particular countries. So they've produced Business Wars in Japanese. The first version of Business Wars there was, I think it was the PlayStation versus the Nintendo N64, something like that. They're now doing stuff about the vaccine, of course, and they've worked with a local broadcaster there, the Nippon Broadcasting System, to make sure that that show is working really well in the Japanese market. And similarly, in Al Jazeera, in the Arab market, they've produced a version of Business Wars there as well. And you'll notice, I mean, just even looking at the artwork, you can see that because Arabic is a right to left language, you can see that even the jagged line is actually going up the correct way for that culture. So there's an awful lot of very clever work in terms of taking a show which has been really successful in one country and making that successful in other countries as well. Also, you can have a look at, for example, American Idol, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, all of those shows which, of course, work really well in other countries as well, but you have to work with local production companies to really help there. Finally, I asked you my little quiz of what do these countries have in common. Mali and the Marshall Islands, and Paraguay and Sao Tome. I don't even know where that is. But anyway, in case you're wondering what the answer to that was, then congratulations. They are the only countries that Great Britain has never invaded. Astonishingly enough, we have invaded pretty well all of them apart from these, which is an amazing thing. Why have I showed you that? Well, I've showed you that because we, the British people, have invaded an awful lot of countries and we have imposed our culture on other people. And I would just warn you not to necessarily rush in and instantly try to impose your culture and what it is that you do on other countries, because that may not work so well. So learning from us and our many invasions, try to bear in mind that content, advertising, platforms and consumption are all different in different countries. And working with local partners and producers will be a really good thing for you to end up doing as you want to expand the shows that you do out into other languages and indeed other countries. Language data costs, incumbent media, and platform adoptions, all factors in different countries that you should just bear in mind. And a plea from me as a journalist, when you are researching, when you are working on new individual countries, please invest in comparable data. Data that we can compare with other countries rather than running an additional piece of research that you can't compare. That it's really, really handy to have comparable data that you would share with the rest of the world. That would be a super good thing, and it would really help us move forward in terms of the world of podcasting. Finally, you should subscribe free to a newsletter. I really try and grab as much non-US news in terms of the podcast world as I can, and try and put it into context for a US audience and a North American audience. Podnews.net is where to grab the free newsletter. You can also find us on your smart speaker or in your favorite podcast app and Spotify. And also there's soundsprofitable.com. If you're interested more in the ad tech side, my friend and colleague Brian Barletta puts that together every single week. It's a great read, and you should definitely grab that too. That's free again at soundsprofitable.com. And that's it from me. I'm going to have a slurp of possibly quite tepid coffee and look forward to going through some of your questions.
Well, fantastic, James. I have not laughed so much in quite a long time. And
Uh-oh.
of course, now I want to drink beer, which I'm not a beer drinker, and buy a Toyota. So,
It's always good.
exactly. All right, we do have some questions for you. I'll ask you to just stop your share and we will
There you
take
go.
some questions. Great. So, the first were sent in advance. What are the opportunities that you see for English language podcasts to find audiences in India?
Yeah, I mean, I think India is a fascinating place, 125 million English speakers. The simple, quick way of getting into that market is to jump onto Ghana and GeoSavan. Most of the big podcast hosts will enable you to do that at the click of a switch. Certainly, Libsyn do that, and various other things. So that's a good thing, and also make sure that you're listed in the Pod LP app as well. There's loads of people who are using that. You might also consider having a look at a lower bitrate version of your show, because the cost of data is one of the most expensive things in many of these particular areas. So yeah, but I think India is a real opportunity, and I know tons of podcasters who have jumped onto Ghana and GeoSavan in particular and seen their audience figures going up, very, very high. So that's been really interesting.
And what genres and types of English language content are most popular?
Yeah, it's a great question. I went into genres and things a while back. Genres do differ, and I think what I've noticed in different markets is, depending on how mature the market is, depends on how much catch-up radio there is there. So if you have a look at South Korea, for example, loads of people listen to podcasts there. North Korea, less so, but South Korea, very good. You can see in South Korea, you can see in Singapore and places like that, that there's an awful lot of reheated radio shows which have been put onto podcasts and are then listened to on demand. I think once you get a more mature podcast market, then you see less of that, and you see more original podcasts which are specifically aimed at the podcast community. But in terms of genres and things, quite a lot of the time it follows, what most people in the US and the UK and Australia, really like, which is a good mix of news, comedy, and educational interviews and that sort of thing. Joe Rogan is, quite often educational, amazingly enough.
So
He
we
certainly
had,
teaches me a thing or two.
yes, I think some of little something for everyone, as it were.
Yeah.
Someone wrote in that it was reported in Podnews that Stitcher Media is the new #1 podcast publisher in the US, according to Triton Digital. And that came as a surprise, given Apple and Spotify seem to dominate the podcast landscape. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I can. Stitcher does two things. It runs a podcast app, which very few people use. Don't get confused with the podcast app that very few people use. It also publishes a ton of really good podcasts that loads of people consume. And that's what that story was about. It was about the podcasts that Stitcher Media produced, things like Earwolf, things like, across the SiriusXM Stitcher market. So that's very much what that story was all about. I would also caution by saying that that was one of the two podcast rankers which is available in the US. That particular podcast ranker is one run by Triton, which is owned by iHeartMedia, but for some reason, iHeartMedia isn't measured in that podcast ranker. So iHeartMedia possibly still is the #1 podcast company in the US. But Stitcher is doing really well in terms of the podcasts that it publishes. In terms of the podcast app, nah, not really. It's there, it's used, but it's nowhere near as large as the Googles and the Spotifys, and indeed the Apple Podcasts of this world.
So let's go back to little genre categories here. What are the top three categories of podcast categories of listeners you're seeing? I know it depends on the countries and the languages spoken.
Yeah, it does. I mean, it's different in every single country, which is interesting. And again, you have that growth of as an individual country becomes more mature, you see less male skew in terms of podcast consumption because there's more content which appeals to everybody. You see less young skew, although podcasting is still very much skewed towards the younger audience. But you see less of that as podcasting begins to mature. And I think the other thing, particularly that I'm noticing in a lot of different countries now, is the growth of fiction podcasting, the growth of scripted podcasts and that sort of thing. That's a real growth area which is doing well, yes, in the US, but also in many other countries across the world. And that's a real opportunity, I think, for doing something that's a little bit different to one celebrity in lockdown interviews another celebrity in lockdown, which we've seen an awful lot of recently. So, it's great to actually see more interesting podcast genres appearing, all over the world.
Do you know how we can see podcast reviews from other countries on Apple Podcasts, etc.?
Yeah, so I mean, bear in mind, of course, that Apple Podcasts might be quite small in some countries, but there's a couple of really easy ways to have a look at the reviews from other countries, because as it is, when you go and have a look in Apple Podcasts, you only see reviews from your own country. So either you can click the flag on the bottom of the Apple Podcasts website, and you can change to a different storefront, and that's lovely, but hugely complicated. Or you can use tools such as mypodcastreviews.com, which is very good, run by Daniel J. Lewis, or Chartable, or there's a bunch of other services which pull in podcast reviews. You can also see a bit of that now in the new Apple Podcasts Connect, assuming that you can gain access to that. And so that will actually give you some good ideas of where you are. Of course, there are also different charts in every single country in the world, particularly for Apple Podcasts. And again, there's a bunch of tools, particularly Chartable, for example, which will actually help you have a look at where you are in all of those different charts. I always find it, great to actually see that the Podnews podcast, while I'm not in large charts in the US or the UK, it's always nice to actually see that, I'm number 12 in the business category in, Uzbekistan or something. That's always nice to have. There's probably nobody else having a listen there, but still, there we are. So there's a bunch of those particular tools that you can actually use to dive into some of the podcast charts and the reviews outside of the particular country where you are.
All right, for US podcasters, what challenges should podcasters keep in mind regarding explicit content and cultural differences that might offend people from outside the Western world?
Oh, yes. Well, so explicit content, first of all. If you mark any of your podcasts as explicit, the rule used to be that you didn't appear in any of the large podcast markets like India, particularly. That's not necessarily the rule anymore, in that when you're using an iPhone, for example, in India, it will actually specifically ask you, do you want explicit content or not? And most people will click, yeah, why not? So it doesn't necessarily matter too much. But I mean, my advice would always be, if you must swear or you must use bad language on a podcast, just ask the question why you're doing that, and ask the question, does it actually really harm it if you moderate your language, if you bleep words out, rather than do any of that. So So in terms of explicit language and stuff like that, my advice is always, I wouldn't do that. But then I come from a radio background, and so of course, I would say that, wouldn't I? In terms of other things, I mean, I think culturally we are all very, very different, and conversations around things that are relatively normal in the US, but not in some countries in the world, will always be interesting and a bit weird to people listening in those countries. But I would also say that. You're at a great advantage in that most people understand what Americans are like, because we have enough American US media anyway. So we kind of aren't phased too much with that. I remember being on a podcast as a guest. It was a travel podcast, and I was talking about Brisbane and all of the wonderful things that you can go and see around here. Very much enjoyed doing that. And I was talking about eating kangaroo. And people were just going, "What? You eat kangaroo?" And it was a dreadful thing. And I had forgotten that kangaroo is a foodstuff here, but it's a nice furry animal that bounces along for many people across the rest of the world. So it's a different conversation, I think, if you're coming at this from a culture that isn't a US or a UK culture that people are actually quite familiar with anyway. So I wouldn't be too worried about that. But I think swearing and that sort of thing will, if you're not careful, just mean that fewer people actually see your show and can actually find it in some of the individual apps.
Fantastic. And now, of course, I want to try kangaroo.
Yeah, it's lovely. It's very, yeah, it's very iron full. I would not recommend crocodile. That's the thing that I wouldn't recommend. It's not very nice. But kangaroo is good. And what's the other? Yeah, no, I should probably leave it there.
I have to say, I've had crocodile, and to me, it tasted very much like chicken. So,
Yeah, it's like fishy chicken. It's
yeah.
not. It's not right. Not right. Yeah. Anyway,
Well, now is
moving
your
on.
your last opportunity to ask James a question. I'll give you guys a minute while I say thank you to him for all these fantastic insights. I hope you do. If you are not already a subscriber to Podnews, go ahead and do that. I know it's part of my early morning reading. And, James, we will eventually let you get back to your coffee. The rest of us evidently have to have a beer after
Yeah,
all of your
absolutely.
recommendations.
Absolutely. Even if you're on the West Coast, get a clock off early.
Oh, it's almost 5 there, right? It's
Yeah,
we're just a few minutes from 5 on the West
yeah.
Coast.
There we go. Should be fine.
All right,
But
if there's
yeah,
if there's no more questions, we will oh, what? There's one coming in. What are your thoughts and observations regarding live events returning in part of the world?
yeah. Thank you, Rich, for that. That's kind of you. I only say that because I think Australia has remembered that we used to be a prison colony, and therefore stopping anybody from going overseas. I now have an Australian passport as well as a UK passport, which means that I can't use either of them, which is brilliant. In terms of live events, I actually took part in a live event a month or so ago called Podcast Day 24, which was great. And we ended up having about 150 podcasters in a room together in Sydney. It was amazing, really good. Probably a bit too risky. We ended up doing that. Melbourne was in lockdown, so we couldn't have anybody from Melbourne. So I ended up having to pre-record all of those on video, which was a nuisance. If we'd have done it now, we couldn't have done it because Sydney is now in lockdown. So I think live events and things like that, it's possibly a little bit too early in many parts of the world. The US has done a fantastic job in terms of vaccination. Thank you for that. Let's give some of those vaccines to us now, please. So I think I would be personally really looking forward to podcast movement. in Nashville, which is coming up, of course, in a month or so's time. That should be a really good thing, and it's a real shame that I can't be there. But massively looking forward to. Hopefully, my hope is Podcast Movement Evolutions in LA next March. That's the one that I'm aiming for. I don't think I'll be able to manage anything for the rest of the year, but I think hopefully Podcast Movement in March should be good. But yeah, you're in a lucky place now, North America. So make the most of it.
Well, we are definitely looking forward to Podcast Movement. In fact, on Wednesday night, August 4th, we will be throwing a party. So, as a TPA member, come and get your free drink ticket and come say hi. And James, we'll look forward to seeing you at Podcast Movement Evolutions. We will be having the Ambies on March 27th of 2022 in Los Angeles, right after Podcast Movement Evolutions. So,
Wow,
looking for a venue now.
maybe I should stay.
You should stay until Sunday
Yeah.
night. It's all part of the package there, definitely.
Excellent. Well, I'm looking forward to it.
Great. Well, we'll look forward to having more than 14 people in the audience at the Ambies and a little bit different. Well, thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. This recording will be available by early next week in the back end of the TPA website. So please invite your fellow members to come and take a listen to all the great information that we got from James. Have a fantastic evening. And James, we will see you soon.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.